What's up, everyone? Thanks for clicking on that video. My name is Sean. I'm the founder here at Upside Strength, your #1 resource for all things fitness and performance in Switzerland. In this presentation today, we're going to dive deep into energy systems and try to update the popular model that is still currently used. But before we jump in, I will urge you to smash that like button and subscribe to the channel so you can get full access to all the free podcasts, presentations, and educational videos that I've already put out and that I will continue putting out in coming days, weeks, months, and years. With that being said, let's jump right into the presentation. So my goal today for this presentation is not to change your mind, is not to convince you of anything. What I would like to do is just offer you a different perspective and see if that perspective makes sense given the evidence that we're going to talk about and given your own experience as well as an athlete or as a coach or as a sports enthusiast in general. On the menu today, we're going to start by reviewing the popular model of bioenergetics that everybody knows, that is still very prevalent in textbooks, courses, and training terminology all around. After that, we're going to look at some of the evidence that's been popping up for over 20 years now that can point us in a slightly different direction. We're going to then attempt to formulate an updated model to what we currently have. And part 4 is going to consist of a couple concepts that are going to help you integrate that new paradigm into your training, your coaching, your testing, etc. And as a little add-on, as a little bonus, we have a guest contribution by Evan Picon. Evan Picon, from whom I have learned most of this stuff, most of the information coming from the energy system world on the updated side comes from him. So I urge you to follow him. And like I said, he will be contributing, because that's actually the right inflection in English. He'll be contributing 10 minutes to the end of that presentation to talk to us about another key concept in the realm of that updated model of bioenergetics. So part 1, let's dive right into the popular model. Let's start from the very beginning. Bioenergetics 101, ATP is the energetic currency of the body. And so a muscular contraction happens, and the energy that is necessary to fuel that contraction comes from the molecule of ATP that is broken down into ADP, and the role of the energy systems in general is to recycle that ADP and turn it back into ATP. One thing I like to point out at the beginning here is that great quote from Pat Davidson, and it is important to remember that the energy systems are a response to something that has happened previously in terms of the ATP being utilized. And really the main goal is to deal with the outcome of the hydrolysis reaction of ATP. It is not, we don't just produce energy like this. We actually use those systems, those pathways, those strategies to recycle the energy and then allow us to keep our cell structure intact and keep our muscle contractions happening and keep living on. Because like I said before, ATP is the energy currency of the body. The popular model of bioenergetics as we know it today, we have our 3 main pathways: the anaerobic alactic pathway, which is sometimes called the ATP PC, and then we have the anaerobic lactic or glycolytic pathway and the aerobic pathway. As you can see here, there's a little bit of overlap, and that's what's been talked about more in recent years, is that they don't work in sequence. It's not one then the other and then the last one. There is overlap. They all work from the beginning, but in different proportions. I think that it's still pretty far from what is actually happening, at least from what we can measure and what we know today. But that's what we'll get into a little bit later. And again, to come back to that foundational point, ATP is there to fuel muscle contractions, amongst other things, obviously. And so in that popular model, what we do is we kind of categorize different athletes by those different energy pathways that they might be using preferentially during their events. So a sprinter is going to be an anaerobic alactic athlete. A marathoner on the other end of the spectrum is going to be an aerobic athlete, while the team sport athlete in the middle might be anaerobic lactic. And in recent years, we've been calling those alactic aerobic, which I think is a step in the right direction, but is still a little bit removed from what we actually see. So why question the popular model? That's a good question. It's always easier to leave things as they are, but as you're going to see in part 2 here, the elephant in the room, there's been many things pointing towards a shift that is needed in the way that we see energy systems and talk about them and use them in our training, in our testing, etc. So we have to look at what has come out in recent years, and that's what part 2 is going to be dedicated to. Exhibit number one from this study, the main points that I want to pull out are that, first of all, phosphocreatine is known as its quickest form of regeneration, and that contractile activity was interrupted when PCR was depleted. So as we saw before, we have muscular contractions happening, we have ATP being broken down into ADP, and then we have phosphocreatine that's there as the energetic temporal buffer to enable us to resynthesize that ATP quickly enough to then produce more force, have further contractions happen. And so that first relationship that we see here from this paper is that if there is no PCR, if there is no phosphocreatine, creatine phosphate, however you want to call it, there are no contractions happening. So that's already an interesting one to talk about, because if we take into account the previous model where PCR gets completely depleted by 10, 15 seconds, depending on who you listen to, well, technically, then you couldn't have any further contractions happening after that point in time, which is obviously not the case. So exhibit number two, we have that great study by Macaulay and al. And what you see on the graph as a solid line is the SMO2 level, so oxygen saturation in the muscle in real time. And then plotted with the dots is phosphocreatine levels. And what you can see from this is that the kinetics, so the behavior, let's say, of those two elements within the bioenergetic process are very much tightly linked. And as we can see, O2 responds instantaneously to the onset of physical activity, and O2 returns to baseline, even a little bit above baseline here. And what is interesting is that PCR follows suit. And so from that study, what we can take as not a conclusion, but as an overall idea, is that oxygen is kind of like phosphocreatine in the way that it behaves in the body during exercise. Then we have exhibit number three. And in this study, what's interesting is the resynthesis of creatine phosphate during recovery normally occurs rapidly, but is totally inhibited if the local circulation to the muscle is occluded. Occluded meaning there is no more blood flow to that area, so no oxygen, no PCR. Again, that tight link between oxygen and phosphocreatine that we've been seeing since the previous example. Exhibit number four, that's actually a little experiment that I did personally with the Moxy 10-second crash course. The Moxy monitor is a unit that allows you to measure in real time oxygen saturation in the muscle locally. And so what you see here are 4 sets of bicep curls. On each set, I increased the weight. And as you can see, so the green line depicts SMO2, which is O2 saturation in the muscle. And so the heavier the loads, the more oxygen is being used by the muscle for the same amount of reps. And so what we see here is that more load is equivalent to more oxygen being used. Now, exhibit number 5, that's off of a test that I did with one of my athletes, with Nico, and that was this time on the bike. It's not strength work anymore, it's more endurance focus. We have 5-minute work intervals and 1-minute rest intervals that you see here in blue and in red. And as you can see, as power goes up, O2 depletion gets larger and larger. So again, more power is equivalent to more oxygen being used. So again, that link between the output and the oxygen utilization. Exhibit number 6 from this great updated paper from George Brooks. George Brooks, who had been talking about lactate since the 80s, that already said back then that it wasn't the bad guy. It's not necessarily the direct cause of fatigue and exercise, but it's actually a really important part of everything that happens in the body. And what I want to highlight here is that lactate is always present, always during exercise, before exercise. Right now, sitting around, you're producing lactate. The only thing is that you're able to recycle it fast enough so that it doesn't accumulate to levels that we then see in really intense and prolonged exercise bouts. But lactate is always present, and it has a really important role in the body, signaling molecule. It can be shuttled from where it's produced to other parts of the body. It can be turned into back into glucose through the liver, but that's for another video. Again, lactate is not the bad guy and is always present, which does go against that original model of bioenergetics, where lactate is only present and is produced between a certain interval time, whether it's from 10 seconds to 2 minutes or 30 seconds to 1.5 minutes, depending on who you listen to again. But what this shows is that it's always present. All these, a little aside, all these papers are going to be linked in the description. I urge you to go and can read them and then draw your own conclusions from them. Like I said at the beginning of this video, I'm not trying to convince you of anything. I'm just showing you what I've found and what is interesting to me, and hope that you can draw your own conclusions from what you look at. Nail in the coffin, exhibit number 7. Here, you have to focus a little bit because it is going to get somewhat complicated, but at the end, if you watch it a couple times, I'm sure you'll get it. So we have muscle contractions happening between 10 and 40 milliseconds. We have ATP being broken down into ADP to fuel those contractions within 15 milliseconds of the onset of contractions. Then we have the phosphocreatine system, if we want to call it that way, that is going to resynthesize our ATP, again, within that 15 millisecond time frame. So that's happening really, really quickly. And then what comes in here, it's a kind of a new player because we don't really talk about glycogen in the original model of bioenergetics, but here, this is from a paper called the glycogen shunt model or hypothesis from Schulman and al. In 2001. So as you can see here, it's almost been 20 years, but most people haven't even heard of it. And what they find through this paper is that actually they're able to see that in order to resynthesize phosphocreatine, glycolysis doesn't have enough substrate to do so, and the aerobic machinery can't do that directly. So what happens is that glycogen provides the ATP to resynthesize phosphocreatine and produces lactate as an end result of that reaction, which is called glycogenolysis. We talk about glycolysis a lot, which is the breakdown of glucose in the blood, but glycogen breakdown is called glycogenolysis. So maybe that's a new term for you to look up. And then what's really interesting is that, and here it gets a little bit complicated, but essentially I'll take it from the top. Glycogen gets broken down into lactate, through which it produces or releases ATP that is going to resynthesize phosphocreatine. The lactate that is produced is then reused through the aerobic system in order to produce the ATP that is going to turn glucose back into glycogen. See, our glycogen levels are always they're always being depleted and they're being refilled up at the same time. That's bad English, but I'll go with it. And that happens through the aerobic machinery and through lactate oxidation. So again, going back to that previous point, lactate is not a bad guy. It's actually a fuel source that we use in the body. In the presence of oxygen, we use lactate to generate the ATP necessary to resynthesize glycogen and keep that little loop going for a while. Now, what happens is when O2 gets low, the aerobic machinery can't do that job anymore. And so glycogen levels get low because now we can't build them back up by turning the glucose into glycogen. So what happens is now glycolysis takes over. Glycogenolysis that we saw previously is kind of downregulated. And then we have now the glucose producing lactate, or as lactate being the end result of glycolysis, giving some ATP to resynthesize phosphocreatine. But like you can see here, the aerobic machinery doesn't work that well anymore without oxygen. So lactate is accumulating, and now you start to understand where this is going. We're not going to go very far like this. So if we were to summarize that glycogen shunt paper, we see that the ATP for phosphocreatine comes directly from glycogen. We see that the aerobic pathway helps resynthesize glycogen, that the glycolytic pathway takes over when O2 or SMO2 is low. Okay, so it's kind of a backup or a safety mechanism, but it is not the primary contributor to the chain of bioenergetics in the presence of sufficient oxygen. All the pathways are working within 150 milliseconds, which changes the picture from what we could see before. And that's primarily due to the fact, little aside, due to the fact that we have measurement tools that allow us to see now on the scale of about 8 milliseconds, if I'm not mistaken, which was not the case before. So obviously, as technology evolves and our understanding of what we can measure changes, what we can see changes as well. Maybe what we see here is wrong because on the 1 millisecond time scale, things happen differently. But as far as we know, this is what we can see today. Exhibit number 8, I urge you to think about last time you had to run up a flight of stairs or do a 50-meter sprint, which are technically in the old book, both anaerobic activities, but tell me at the end of that 6 seconds of full-out effort if you don't need to breathe a little harder. Why do you have to breathe a little harder? Because you just created an oxygen debt that you have to repay, and hence oxygen is being used instantaneously, and it does not wait for the anaerobic alactic and the anaerobic lactic systems to be done to then take over. Oxygen happens right away. So if we summarize the evidence that we looked at up until now, phosphocreatine resynthesizes ATP4 to fuel muscular contractions and other important processes in the body. O2 and phosphocreatine are tightly coupled. We saw that through multiple papers, multiple examples as well. More load or power equals more O2 utilized. Glycogen is the buffer between the phosphocreatine system and the aerobic machinery. So it does the link. Lactate is a fuel and is always present in the body, which again goes against that previous model. And so what we slowly see appearing here is that tight relationship between load power, ATP levels or ATP usage, and then PCR, and then glycogen, and then O2. So as you can see, big surprise, everything is connected as we know it is in the body. So now part 3, let's look at an updated model of bioenergetics. What can we do from that evidence to build something that maybe makes a little bit more sense? So let's take the popular model and let's kind of change it around and see if we can come to something that makes a little bit more sense. So as we saw, we have phosphocreatine, and we have glycogenolysis, and we have the aerobic machinery all working together. And when those start to dwindle down, especially the aerobic and the glycogenolytic, I guess is the term, systems start to be downregulated due to the lack of oxygen available, we have the glycolytic system that is still there to provide some phosphocreatine, but it's not going to last for very long. And so to simplify this, and that was a graph that Aaron Davis put together that I found spoke to me in terms of its structure. This might be a better way to represent what is going on in terms of bioenergetics. The timescale at the bottom doesn't actually matter, because now what we can do is apply this to every type of athlete. There is no anaerobic alactic athletes. There is no purely aerobic athlete. Everybody is aerobic, everybody is lactic, because oxygen is always present, is always being used, and lactate is always present and always being used as well. But those different athletes simply use those differently in terms of oxygen utilization. The sprinter is going to try and empty his tank as quickly as possible to produce maximum output and get to the finish line as fast as possible. I'm simplifying, but it makes sense like this. And then the aerobic athlete is going to try and not empty that tank quickly, try to keep it full for as long as possible until the end, where a team sport athlete or repeat high intensity effort type sport will require those same efforts, but in succession. And so maybe I could have drawn that green line going back up from the bottom of that first triangle to the top of the second one, because oxygen goes back up once you stop the effort or reduce the intensity, and then you repeat those efforts over and over. But that kind of unifies things a little bit more than the previous one, where you had different athletes using different systems. No, we all use them. They're all the same. We just use them slightly. We just use the overall machinery a little bit differently. Another way to represent those dynamics might be this graph. So we have that relationship between muscular contractions, ATP that is not present here, the phosphocreatine system that interacts directly with glycogen, both through its breakdown and through its resynthesis, which is called glycogenesis, the aerobic metabolism that is at the base of all of this, and we have glycolysis at this point that is here, but is still a small player. And here we are in the presence of sufficient oxygen levels. Now, as oxygen gets depleted, we see that aerobic pathway and the glycogen aspect of things gets downregulated, and we have glycolysis that takes a bigger role. And again, to reiterate this, every pathway is active under 150 milliseconds. All models are wrong, but some are useful, which I think is kind of a staple quote nowadays when talking about models and ways to see things. So where does it leave us? So at the end of this, you're either depressed because you find out that everything you've learned about energy systems is wrong, or you decide to willfully ignore the evidence of everything that is around you and that you see and think that it is fine and that you can just move on the way that it is. So from here, part 4, I want to look at some key concepts that are going to help us understand that new model and make it a little bit more practical and applicable to what we do in everyday life, especially on the exercise side, so testing, training, coaching, etc. I like this quote from Evan Picon that draws a slightly simpler story than what we've been told from the beginning. So instead of thinking this athlete is limited by their anaerobic alactic abilities, if we understand that they're limited by their respiratory system, that gives us a very different way of approaching training from a top-down standpoint. So what he means by this, it actually refers back to an idea that was put out by Jörg Feldman many years ago, which is called the limiter and compensator idea. And so in this model, in this idea, we have 4 primary systems that can become bottlenecks to performance when we talk about exercise. We first have the brain that plays the role of the central governor, the respiratory system that takes care of loading O2 into the blood and getting CO2 out of the system, the circulatory system that is going to pump the oxygenated blood in and pump the deoxygenated blood or the CO2 loaded blood out or back to the lungs to be extracted. And then the end user in that story, the muscle, locally, that is going to be using the oxygen that is provided. And so if we take that framework and make a little, animation out of it, we would have the brain that regulates all those different systems. The muscle is where everything starts with the contraction that uses O2, that necessitates more O2 that is brought in from the environment through our respiratory system, through the heart, pumped to the muscle, and then on the back end, CO2 is brought back to the lungs for extraction. Obviously, it's simplified, but you get the gist of it. And what we find is that those different systems, not everybody is going to be limited by the same system. So if we take our 3 avatars here, we have our beginner that might actually be limited by his capacity to utilize the oxygen that is already in the blood. Maybe it's lack of mitochondrial density, maybe it's lack of capillaries, maybe it's lack of neuromuscular coordination, the ability to fire in the appropriate sequence in order to recruit maximally. So all those things might appear as a limitation in that avatar of the beginner athlete. Then we take the power athlete, the muscle-bound athlete, and as an idea, we can say that, hey, this guy might be limited by his delivery system because maybe his heart isn't strong enough to push enough blood and enough oxygen through the tension in his muscles, and that might be his limiting factor in terms of performance. And if we take the elite endurance athlete, he's got really good utilization capabilities, really good mitochondrial density, capillaries, firing, all those things. His heart is strong, lots of capacity there, but now maybe he's limited in his capacity to either load O2 or offload CO2, or maybe it's a limitation in terms of his respiratory muscle endurance, strength, etc., etc. You get the picture. And those don't have to always be like this, but this is really just an oversimplification to paint the picture of how things might play out in this idea of the different physiological limiters in terms of exercise performance. And so what we have now is with different people and different limitations, we have different reactions to different protocols. So for example, you take someone who is already limited by their ability to utilize oxygen at the muscle, and you put them on a cardiac output protocol that would try and enhance eccentric hypertrophy of the left ventricle, to try and pump more blood with each heartbeat, to try and bring more oxygen to the muscle. Well, that's not going to help him a lot or at all, because he can't use it. So if he can't use it as it is, bringing twice as much isn't going to help him use more of it. So that might explain why some people are responders and non-responders to different protocols, depending on their limitations. On the other hand, somebody who has a delivery limitation in terms of his circulatory, his cardiovascular system, he will usually respond quite well because those adaptations are going to help him with his limitation. Another key concept that I wanted to touch on here, occlusion trends in the muscle. So what is an occlusion? For me, the best way I have to kind of picture it, it's a fight between the muscle tension that is created locally and the ability of the heart to push blood through that tension. And so that interplay between the two is what creates occlusions, and different types of occlusions can happen. We have first and foremost a compression reaction that still lets blood in and lets blood out. Okay, so that's pretty simple. Then we have a venous occlusion. So here we have fresh blood coming in, but we don't have any outflow. We don't have blood coming out of the muscle. And so oxygen is still coming in and we can still keep on using it, but we're not extracting CO2, we're not extracting hydrogen ions, and our time is probably limited here. Arterial occlusions, on the other hand, you get no blood in, you get no blood out, and so your time is really, really limited. You don't have much time left when you're in that area, and so that is another key concept in my mind to understand in order to apply that new model of energy systems to what we do. How might we see this appear in different types of individuals? So if we take our two avatars again, we have the delivery limited athlete and the respiratory limited athlete, and they're actually going to present with different presentations, for lack of a better word, between those types of occlusion reactions. So we have, for example, the cardiac limited athlete might see compression reactions only up to 25% of his 1RM. So he might start cutting outflow out of the muscle in the area of 30%. Okay, all the way up to 65, potentially 65% of his 1RM. There is no blood going out of the muscle. It's going in, but it's not going out. And above 65, above 70, boom, arterial occlusion, no blood in, no blood out. And like we said before, his time is greatly limited here. You might have one more rep. You might just have to grind it out, but there's really not much left in the tank. And that might change very much from somebody with a respiratory limitation who might not occlude on the venous side up until 45% of his 1RM. What does it mean? It means that he can get steady blood flow to the muscle at much higher percentages of his 1 rep max. Same for the venous occlusion. It might happen, like I said, not until 45% and all the way up to sometimes upwards of 80% of his 1RM. So what does it mean? It means, again, his heart is really strong and the tension that he creates in the muscles locally isn't strong enough to counter the blood flow coming from the heart. How to find those limiters and determine those occlusion trends? You can use a Moxy monitor or any NIRS device. I urge you to watch the podcast that I recorded with Andrew Feldman on the topic if you're not familiar with the technology. But through different testing protocols, you can determine physiological limiters and occlusion trends. Now I want to go to the guest contribution of this presentation. So what if you don't have a Moxy? How can you determine those limiters without using a Moxy? And so in this little bonus segment, Evan is going to talk about how to do this without any additional technology, simply using a few different tests, but I'll leave it to Evan. Your turn, buddy. Go.
How do we take this information about finding an athlete's limiter with NIRS and make it practical and accessible for coaches who don't have access to that same technology? The answer is that we find a meaningful proxy measurement. A proxy is an indirect measure that's strongly correlated with the actual thing that we're trying to measure. So for example, let's say Sean and I wanted to investigate which of our home cities are hotter, but neither of us owned a thermometer for some reason. Through Sean and I's joint intelligence, we realized that the speed at which ice cream melts is correlated with the temperature outside of our homes. So Sean and I both grab an ice cream cone, we both pop 2 or 3 scoops in like you see in this picture here, and then we both stand outside of our homes. Inevitably, the ice cream melts quicker where I'm located right outside of Atlanta versus his home in Northern Europe. But now what happens if we want to contextualize this information? Well, we have all of our athletes scattered across the world all conduct this exact same experiment, and we discover that the closer you are to the equator, the quicker ice cream melts. Of course, we didn't measure the absolute temperature in any of these different locations, but by using this ice cream proxy, we're able to get a reasonable estimate of temperature differences between individual locations without having to take a temperature measure. So obviously some of the weaknesses with this type of proxy measurement is that we don't really know the absolute temperature value in any of the locations where we conducted this experiment. But at the very least, it could give us a ballpark estimate where I could say, well, Atlanta is going to be hotter than New York in any given month. Or if an ice cream cone takes 5 minutes to melt right now at the end of the summer, and it takes 4 hours to melt in a month from now, it means it's hotter right now. So let's extend this analogy to NIRS. First and foremost, if we're going to create a reasonable proxy for finding out an athlete's limiter without NIRS and figuring out what a good proxy measurement is, we need to know what we're actually looking for in NIRS data. So when we're discussing things like delivery, utilization, and respiratory limitations, what we're really trying to understand is what factor is limiting someone's VO2 max. Since VO2 max represents the maximum integrated capacity of the pulmonary system, cardiovascular system, and muscular system to uptake, transport, and utilize oxygen respectively. Well, if we think about how VO2 max is calculated with the Fick equation featured at the bottom of the screen, VO2 max is calculated as Q times Ca VO2, where Q represents cardiac output and Ca VO2 represents the arteriovenous oxygen difference. This is the difference between oxygen concentration in the arterial blood and the venous blood. Well, looking at the screen here, we have two athletes doing a Wingate assessment, and we have both their muscle oxygen saturation, or SMO2, plotted on the chart, as well as their SpO2, which is their arterial oxygen saturation. One of the first things that I noticed when looking at this chart is that the athlete on the left's lowest SMO2 is right around 37%, and their lowest SpO2, it's right around 97 or 98%. So their arteriovenous oxygen difference is roughly 60%. On the other hand, if we look at the athlete on the right, they touch down right about 3% muscle oxygen saturation at the lowest, and their lowest arterial oxygen saturation is right around 97%. So their greatest arteriovenous oxygen difference is 94%. Well, factoring in how these things impact VO2 max, if we want the athlete on the left to improve their VO2 max, sure, improving their maximal cardiac output might help, but they have a very small arteriovenous oxygen concentration difference, and that's because this athlete has a utilization limitation. So if we were able to improve this athlete's magnitude and rate of oxygen utilization, we would expand that arteriovenous oxygen concentration difference, and as a result of that, they would likely see an increase in VO2 max. Well, if we look at that athlete on the right, we're probably not going to increase their VO2 max by expanding the arteriovenous oxygen difference. They're probably not going to desaturate the muscle much lower than 3%. We can't go to negative numbers. And increasing their arterial oxygen saturation by 1 to 2% isn't going to have a big return on investment either. So in this case, this athlete is likely going to be limited by their delivery or maximal cardiac output. So in order to improve their VO2 max, we need to focus on this Q part of the equation. Well, what happens if we have an athlete that's limited by pulmonary diffusion? If they have a low arterial oxygen saturation, maybe in the range of 88 to 92%, improving their arterial oxygen saturation difference will increase this arteriovenous difference, and improving their maximal cardiac output will factor in as well. So we could quickly see how different athletes will improve their VO2 max through different means. Well, now if we want to do a proxy test, it needs to be something where the results have a strong correlation to the different limiters that we could pick up on NIRS, in the same way that the rate that ice cream melts has a fairly strong correlation to the temperature outside. One way to do this is with the speed preservation profile. When we conduct a speed preservation profile, we're taking an athlete's PR pace on multiple distances, and we're graphing out relationships between these values. Typically, this is either done with rowing or running. The way that this is done for rowing is with a 500-meter average pace. For running, you'll typically use a 400-meter split pace. And in both of these, we're calculating pace in seconds. So if you had an 8-minute 2K row, you would put 120 seconds on the top of this equation. And if your 5K PR pace was 128 seconds per 500 meter, you'd put that on the bottom, you would do the math, and you'd get a percentage. For every athlete, you'll graph all four of these, and you'll plot all four values on this chart. These are 7 theoretical avatars that we have here, and the important thing to keep in mind is that the closer someone gets to a type A, the more likely it is that they're delivery limited. So if we plot them on this chart and they land right at 85% for their 2K to 5K speed preservation score, then we would do test number 2, their 1K to 2K speed preservation score, and maybe they get 90%. You could already imagine how there's going to be a trend line going across these 4 boxes. The closer someone is to a type G athlete, the more likely it is that they're utilization limited. The closer they are to type D, the more likely it is that they're respiratory limited. Any of these between types are going to be a combination of the two limitations that sandwich them on either side. So type B is a combination between delivery and respiratory, but closer to delivery and so forth. One of the strengths of this type of assessment is that it's really easy to run and it's very easy to plot some out on this chart. One of the weaknesses is that it doesn't actually give us physiological measurements and it doesn't tell us why someone presents with one of these limitations. But using this, we could graph out all these theoretical types of athletes and we could have a chart with all 7 of these avatars. Then what we could do with our data is graph it against these 7 avatars and see which line our athlete best fits to. Since there's a very tight range of percentages, I personally find that it's easier to graph on a logarithmic scale. So this is converting the graph to a log scale. And again, we have these same 7 avatars. On the lowest end, we have a delivery limited athlete. On the highest, we have a utilization limited athlete. Now I'm going to plot an athlete's data against these different scores. This would be an athlete with a 2K to 5K speed preservation score of roughly 91%, a 1K to 2K speed preservation score of roughly 93%, and so forth. So this athlete's line of best fit would be right between an athlete that's kind of a blend of a respiratory and utilization limited athlete and a pure respiratory limited athlete. So we can infer this athlete is probably showing some signs of a pulmonary limitation, but they could also improve by improving their rate or magnitude of oxygen utilization. So when I'm working with this athlete, I would start to think about training protocols that are going to improve one of those 2 physiologic variables, would introduce those into an athlete's training program. Then I would reassess them over time and see if they start shifting more towards a respiratory limited athlete, and we'll see if we're getting a meaningful performance improvement.
Thanks so much, Evan, for contributing that piece of information to the presentation. I think it's going to be really valuable for many people. So picking up from here, what I hope that this presentation brought to you is simply a new lens. I want you to put your training methods, your vocabulary, your testing protocols, your own model, all this through that new lens and see if you can find anything beneficial from it. Like we say, change is good, but it's never easy. So take the time to consider everything that was talked about, read the papers, draw your own conclusions, and change your mind, but only if that makes sense to you. I didn't come to those things by myself. I didn't invent any of that. I learned from people that have done great things before me. So I urge you to follow all those people and all the work that they have put out on those different topics, because this is how you learn. If you want a deeper dive, I've linked those different videos and articles in the description of the video, of the presentation, so you can go and watch those and understand a little bit more about this kind of whole new world of bioenergetics. And I would really love to hear from you in the comments below this video. Make sure you ask a question. If there's something not clear, please point it out. If I said something wrong, please point it out. I'm always happy to be put on the spot if I say something that's inaccurate. But I hope that you got something out of this presentation. Really thank you for watching this. Like I said at the beginning, please make sure you like, share, and subscribe to the channel to get all my future videos. And I will see you soon for another great presentation. Take care.